This video is intended to help students understand the stages model of the policy process. What is the stages model? What can it do? What can't it do? Well, it's a model of the policy process. In other words, how governments decide to act. And much of the material in this presentation is taken from Guy Peters' book, American Public Policy. This model has some limitations. It's a descriptive model and not a causal model, which means it describes the policy process but doesn't tell you what causes something else to happen. It's also not a sequential model. There's no clear starting point, and there could be multiple stages of the model invoked at any given time. It's also best at describing formal policies such as lawmaking or budgeting or those formal processes of government more so than informal policymaking at a local level. The stages model, as the name implies, describes policymaking by putting activities into one of 5 different stages. Those stages are policy evaluation, agenda setting, policy analysis and formulation, legitimation, and implementation. And again, there's no clear starting point. Things could begin with agenda setting by a policymaker deciding he's going to do something. It could start with evaluation, where a report is done looking at the state of society. So it could start anywhere. We're going to start with policy evaluation. So policy evaluation can be thought of as doing policy analysis for understanding. What do we mean by that? It's about assessing the state of society and the efficacy of existing policies that are out there. So we may be looking at something like poverty, and we would want to do research to see what is the state of poverty in America and how are current poverty programs working. So this evaluation, we're going to talk about how it's done, what's done, who does it, and what are some of the factors that affect the quality of the evaluation that's done. So policy evaluation is both a political process and an analytical process. It's political in that the people who are asking the questions and the questions that they're asking, and in a lot of cases the motivations behind that, often dictate the quality of the answers you get back and the quality of the information that we get back. In our poverty example, if those who are running poverty programs are asking the question, they may frame that question in a way that makes them or their programs look good, which would be different from an independent group looking at it. And if they're looking at poverty, there's an analytical piece to this, right? And the analysis for understanding is different from analysis for decision making. We'll get to analysis for decision making in our 3rd stage, that policy analysis and formulation stage. Here we're just trying to understand the state of society. And so what we do is we focus on understanding a situation more than reaching some conclusion. Analysis for evaluation or analysis for understanding is typically done periodically. We'll do this every couple of years, not because a decision needs to be made. And so it can often wait. There's no sense of urgency with this type of evaluation usually. Typically it's widely circulated, as opposed to doing it just for a particular decision maker. It may reflect multiple opinions rather than a consensus. It may list various approaches. It may list various ways of looking at the problem. And it's typically not focused on alternative solutions to the problem, just understanding whatever this problem is in society. So going back to this political process and who's doing the asking and what are they asking, there's 2 key elements to this kind of evaluation. What are you measuring? What are you counting? And who is included? So if we're looking at poverty, we may be looking at poverty among senior citizens, which could be different from poverty among people who live in rural communities, or poverty among veterans, or something like that. So we have to be careful about drawing general conclusions if the evaluation was narrowly measured or narrowly targeted. Who does this sort of work? Lots of people. Government agencies themselves often do this kind of evaluation because they're charged with dealing with certain problems in society, and so they're going to want to understand them. So they'll commission studies or do them themselves. Auditors do this. The legislature may do it. Interest groups and academics and think tanks are often doing it, and investigative journalists do this kind of work. So what are some of the factors affecting the quality of this analysis? Well, one is the time period from intervention to effect. A lot of the issues that we deal with in society are protracted and take a long time to solve. Solving something like poverty or literacy or dealing with climate change takes a long time, and there are a number of intervening factors that may occur between the time the policy was made and when we're doing our measurement. Typically, there's lots of causal factors. There are many, many things that cause poverty, for instance, in a society, and the evaluation certainly isn't going to be able to look at all of them. We're also constantly changing policies, and policies are being enacted at local, state, federal levels, and so it's difficult to isolate the effect of one policy versus others. And then there's oftentimes a difference between what policy was intended and what policy was implemented. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the policy implementation stage. So this is policy evaluation, trying to understand what's going on in society, but recognizing that we're never going to have a complete objective picture of that. The next stage in the stages model is agenda setting. So what do we mean by agenda setting? That a particular problem in society is identified. That problem is deemed to be amenable to government action, and it actually captures the attention of some policymaker so that they are motivated to do something about it. So let's explore these three elements to this definition, and then we'll talk about some of the factors affecting whether or not something gets on the agenda, and then who does this agenda setting process. So the first one is we identify a problem in society. And it's important here that to consider the role of labeling and framing. Think of immigration as a policy area. You could frame the immigration question as a question of law and order. You could frame it as a question of human rights. You could frame it as a question of economics. You could frame it as a question of population mobility. You could frame it as a lot of different things. And how you frame it has a lot to do with whether or not it actually, A, would be amenable to government action, or B, capture the attention of a policymaker, and also the ultimate policies that would be appropriate to deal with that. The appropriate policies to deal with the humanitarian crisis are different than those that would be appropriate to deal with an economic phenomenon. So what would make a particular problem amenable to government action? Well, isn't it an existing government function? We know that immigration is an existing government function, so that would help. The issue of public goods, which you may have learned about in an economics class. A public good is one that is you can't exclude people from, and if one person uses it, it doesn't necessarily take it away from others. The classic example is a fireworks display. If I shoot off fireworks, I can't keep people from seeing the fireworks. It's available to everybody. And if you see the fireworks, that doesn't prevent me from seeing the fireworks. You're not consuming the fireworks, right? And so in matters of public goods, there's not much incentive for the private sector, a profit-seeking private sector, to provide these things. And so government typically does. So if we're dealing with an issue of public goods, government's more likely to be involved. If we're dealing with issues of positive or negative externalities, think of things like pollution as a negative externality. These are times when government tends to step in to correct that cost in society. And maybe there's just no private means for solving this problem. In that case, government will tend to step in. So we have this problem identified. We've deemed it amenable to government action, and now we have to capture the attention of policymakers, and oftentimes a focusing event is what gets on their attention. Maybe it's the publication of a report that came out of the policy evaluation stage. Maybe it's a story in the news. Maybe it's some sort of a crisis. There are a number of factors that affect capturing the attention. How big is the problem? Who is affected by this problem? Problems involving veterans or small children or senior citizens may capture more attention than those affecting the ordinary able-bodied, adult. Analogies and spillover effects are important. Terrorism became on the agenda as a spillover effect of the terrorist attacks, right, of 9/11. Symbolism, ideals, things like freedom, transparency, civil rights, those kinds of things can affect whether or not things get on the agenda. And notice there's a line connecting effects of the problem with who was targeted or included in the evaluation. If the evaluation comes out and says this vulnerable population is at risk, it's more likely to end up on the agenda. The who does agenda setting? Some of the same people who do policy evaluation. But there's three kind of approaches to this idea of agenda setting. How do we get this thing on some policymaker's mind? There is what they call the pluralist approach, where the idea itself is compelling, and there's no individual necessarily involved in promoting this problem, this issue, to the policymaker. It's just something that's worth doing. It's a good idea. Think of something like an epidemic of a disease, coronavirus, SARS, avian flu, something like that. We don't need a spokesperson to say we ought to do something about this. The problem itself is compelling. The state-centric approach says that government oftentimes puts things on the agenda themselves. Who understands education problems better than educators and public school teachers and state universities? And so they will propose that the legislature say, take on an issue, or they will initiate some new policy from within the government. Finally, the elitist approach recognizes that there are some voices in society that are louder than others. There are celebrities, there are politicians, there are captains of industry who, when they raise issues, are more likely to capture the attention of some government official than the ordinary citizen. So these are three basic mechanisms for getting these problems on the minds of policymakers. So now we've studied society. We've got this problem on the mind of a policymaker. Now it's time to do some policy analysis and policy formulation. Here we're going to study the problem and develop mechanisms for solving this problem. So now we're in the world of analysis for decision making, and contrast that to the analysis for understanding we did earlier. Now we want to do analysis to help a particular decision maker make a decision. And that usually involves two elements. An economic analysis, typically in the form of a cost-benefit analysis or a cost-effectiveness analysis. We will look at alternative courses of action and weigh costs against benefits. But in the public sector, we also, and more so in the private sector than in the past, we do an ethical analysis. And so for government, this is about things like preserving life, dealing with the disease, or dealing with the safety of the highways, or consumer product safety, those kinds of things. Another ethical consideration is preservation of individual autonomy. We have civil rights, and we don't want government's solution to a problem to infringe on some of those rights. Another ethical consideration is transparency and openness of government. And finally, questions of fairness and equity and desert. What do people deserve? whether you're a criminal and deserve punishment or you are a vulnerable member of the population and deserve some protection. Um, so those are some of the ethical things that are considered when designing policies. So what's the process for this? Um, Doing analysis for decision making is typically a 6-step process. We want to define the problem, and this goes back to the labeling question from earlier, right? Targeting and measuring. We need to determine some evaluative criteria. How do we know when we have a good solution? By what criteria would we evaluate our alternatives? They may be economic, they may be ethical. We gather the data, we look at the various alternatives, we project what will happen if we pursue those alternatives, and think about the outcomes that would occur, evaluate them against our criteria, and then report those results to the decision maker. So this is basic policy analysis 101. Right? So that's the process. What are some of the tools of policy that are available to us? If government decides it wants to do something, what's in its toolbox? What could it do? Well, first of all, it could decide to take no action. It could deliberately choose to do nothing. And I think the best example of this would be the Federal Reserve Board. Federal Reserve Board will occasionally come out and say, so the Federal Reserve, if you don't know, their job is to kind of manage the money supply in a way that keeps prices under control and keeps the economy stimulated for full employment. So full employment, low inflation is their goal. And there are times when they will look at the state of the economy and they will decide, hey, we don't need to do anything right now. The economy is just fine. If we intervene, we may mess it up. So their tool of policy in those cases is to deliberately do nothing. So when you hear on the news, the Fed decided not to change interest rates, that's an example of deliberate non-action. Another thing government could do is devolve the problem down to a lower level of government. So we see this when the federal government decides that it's going to give a block grant to a state and let the state design a solution to this problem. Another thing government can do is write a law. They can create duties and obligations for citizens and companies and other members of society. They can provide services directly, such as public education or national defense or a state park. I'm going to skip money for a second and go down to moral suasion. Moral suasion is government can simply use the bully pulpit. They could ask people to change their behavior. A good example of this was during the droughts of 2015 to 2018 in the state of California. The state government asked people to conserve water, and water consumption fell by about 20%. And they didn't write a law. They didn't go out and turn off spigots or anything like that. They just used their tools of persuasion and asked people to conserve. And it worked. Now, money is a final tool of policy, and we can use money in a couple of different ways. The way we allocate money to different government entities, services, how much money we give to the court system in order to have trials more speedy or whatever, the way we allocate money to schools. We also use the tax code as a tool of policy. The fact that you can deduct mortgage interest from your taxes, you can deduct charitable contributions, those kinds of things are doing public policy through the tax code. The third thing they can do with money are do things like government insurance, like flood insurance, or student loan programs, those kinds of things are all various tools. So if you're a policymaker, you see this problem in society, and you think about what should we do about it, you've got a number of tools. You can ask another government to do it, you can write a law, you can provide a service, you can create financial incentives, you can just talk to people. Right, so who does this policy formulation? And you notice this who thing links back to the other who's, because there are similar sets of folks, right? The bureaucracy comes up with these solutions because the bureaucracy was back there and put it on the agenda and they understand the issue. think tanks and interest groups, same thing. Academics, legislators, and by shadow government, I don't mean like anything dark or nefarious. Shadow government would be those people who have been in government in the past or aspire to be in government in the future who go on the news shows, go on the Sunday morning shows, write op-eds to their newspaper, and make suggestions for government. They may testify before Congress. So these are experts who may not be affiliated with a particular university or think tank, and they're not currently in government. They all come up with ideas for how government could be better. Okay, so to review, we've gone through policy evaluation. We've tried to understand the world. Agenda setting, this problem has captured a policymaker's attention. We've gone through a decision process and come up with an idea. Now, we don't just jump to implementation because we're dealing with a government here and not a private company. So we've got this legitimation step first. Legitimation is about accepting this policy as legitimate and authoritative, as legal, typically by going through some formal government process. Okay. Now, it's important here to understand that this is an objective standard, not a subjective one. So you might say, hey, I don't like Obamacare or the border wall, and I think those ideas are illegitimate. That's a subjective view. That's sort of an opinion, right? What we're talking about here is whether or not the right process was used. For both Obamacare and building the border wall, the government, the administrations, went through a particular process. And if the right process is followed, then we say that the policy is legitimate. Okay, so it's an objective standard as opposed to a subjective one. So what are the sources of legitimation? Well, it's our three branches of government as well as some democratic processes. Within the legislature, we're talking about writing laws or conducting oversight and investigations into what's going on in the executive branch, the two main functions of Congress. Now, what's good about the legislature as a source of legitimation? Well, it's a majoritarian process, right? Majority rules. And these are elected representative officials. Some concerns, though, are things like log rolling and pork barreling, adding limitations and riders onto legislation that erode public's confidence in that process. Next is the executive branch of government. And here we're talking about administrative agencies who have rule-making ability. Think of the Federal Communications Commission, the Food and Drug Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency. These are executive branch agencies that have been given some rule-making power. Executive orders also fall in this category. What are the benefits here? Well, Congress created agencies like the Food and Drug Administration so that Congress didn't have to pass a law every time a new drug came to market. We have experts, we have doctors, we have researchers who will study that and be less political about it and more scientific, people who are closer to the problem, who understand that problem better. But there's concerns with that, right? There's a little less oversight. These are typically unelected people. There's not a majority vote kind of a system here. And so it's not quite as open, it's not quite as democratic as having a legislature do it. Third is the judiciary, who interprets laws, determines whether or not something's constitutional or not, helps us understand these rules that others have created when they come up in disputes. Right? Benefits of this, it's a check on the other branches. Right? We don't want the legislature or the executive overstepping their legal authority. So the judiciary is a check on the legitimation of the work done by the other branches, and they kind of have the final word on these things. The concern, again, is that this is a non-majoritarian process by unelected people. And then lastly, we can legitimate a policy through some democratic process like a referenda or an initiative, the things you see on the ballot on election day. You pick your presidential candidate and your senator and your representative, and then there may be a list of these local or statewide initiatives, propositions, things that you would vote on. The benefits of that, it's purely democratic process, right? Majority gets to decide. Some of the concerns, though, is this idea of the tyranny of the majority. Um, if there was a proposition that said, vote on whether or not Bill Gates's tens of billions of dollars should be distributed to the residents of our small town, everyone's going to vote for that, right? But that's not correct. It's not a kind of a fair thing to do. And oftentimes some of these problems are very complex, and the average citizen doesn't have the time or the inclination to study them effectively, right? Which is why we would want maybe an executive agency with experts to work on those problems rather than just put them up for a vote. So we've come up with this policy and we run it through one of these processes, or maybe multiple processes. There could be a law that gets tested in the court, or there could be a law that creates an executive agency that comes up with a rule that gets tested in a court. So we've got this legitimation process to make sure that government is functioning as it should. So now we finally get to implement this policy. Right? So policy implementation is about the actual actions of government that put this policy into effect, with the recognition that what's implemented may not be what was intended, because we went through a number of steps here from our analysis through legitimation to actual implementation, and those who wrote the policy aren't necessarily the ones enacting it. They're not the ones at the front level doing this work. So what are some factors that affect the successful implementation of a public policy? Well, one of them is information flows. What do we mean by that? Right? How specific and clear was the legislation that the legislature put together here? Maybe it was clear, but as it's communicated down the chain of command, or information about implementation bubbles up the chain of command, you may remember that childhood game of telephone where you whisper something in somebody's ear and they whisper it in somebody else's, and after you get through about 10 people, the message is garbled, right? Well, this happens in government too. So as a policy, as the intent of a policy moves down the chain of command, you may have mid-level managers or executives or frontline workers who may interpret it differently or may care about different things. And so that could change what's actually implemented from what was intended, right? And you also have targeting issues that go back to this question of evaluation. Who was targeted when we evaluated it? Are they the same people who are targeted when we implement it? Okay. Another thing that could occur is the allocation of decision rights. So again, as the communication goes down the chain of command, you may have people with local goals who are substituting their desires for the global goals that may have been part of this original policy. And the more layers there are, the more likely there is to be a divergence of those. So if you think about a policy like, I'm a veteran, so I go to the VA hospital to be evaluated to determine whether or not I have a disability and how severe is my disability. The people who are really making that decision are not the people who wrote the policies about disabilities. It's the doctor who evaluates me, right? It's the frontline worker. And you can imagine a situation where if the VA hospital is really tight on money, they may be less likely to say I have a disability. Or if they have plenty of money or they're just a good-hearted person, they may be more gracious in that. And you find this in a lot of places in designing individualized education programs for special needs kids. It's that frontline worker who's really determining the policy. The next factor affecting implementation is the time horizon. Remember that some of these problems are persistent in society. Poverty is a persistent problem. Disease is a persistent problem. National security is a persistent problem. And so it takes a long time, if ever, to solve some of these things. And we may have decision makers with a short-term perspective. Hey, I'm only in office for 3 years. I need a quick win. And so the policy that's implemented may not really be too effective at the problem because the problem is entrenched. Last is the adaptability of the organization of the government agency. One of the strengths of a bureaucracy is that it's stable, that the public can depend on it, that what was decided last week will be decided next week. And so there is a strong cultural resistance to change. A stable, predictable government is not a flexible one. And so they can do a little bit of violence to each other. So let's zoom out a little bit. Here is our stages model. Policy evaluation, understanding the state of society and how effective are current programs. Agenda setting, does that problem capture the attention of a policymaker, and is it the kind of thing government ought to do? Policy analysis and formulation, understanding alternative solutions to the problem and evaluating those and deciding what to do. Running it through a proper process of government so that it is legitimate, and then implementing it knowing that is a good chance what gets implemented may be a little different from what was intended. So you can think of a number of different policies. Take the Affordable Care Act. It went through an evaluation process of the state of healthcare in America. It was on Congress's agenda. They came up with this solution. It went through Congress, was enacted, but then it kind of got stuck in while it was being implemented, it went back to policy legitimation as portions of it were tested in the courts. And we had members of Congress who didn't like that idea and wanted to overturn it, so it never really left the agenda. Right? So here we had a policy that was still an agenda setting. Alternatives were being discussed. It was being tested in the courts while it was being implemented. So there was a public policy that had in 4 stages simultaneously. So that's one of the things about this model, right, is it's not a neat sequential process. You could have multiple stages enacted at any one time. So there is a quick introduction to the stages model.